my flag, Junior. Don't forget to vote on November the 3rd.
You are an illegal alien. We are the landlords of this country, and your visa has expired. You all look pretty pathetic when you're outnumbered, you know? Hey, all 5 of you!
Only the Italians are celebrating the Spanish Jew as a hero and a visionary. And he said, no, I don't want that. The blacks got a national holiday for Martin Luther King Day. While the whites are reneging on everything. The civil rights movement is dead for the blacks because they got a national holiday. Hell no, I don't want a national holiday. That doesn't mean they'll finish up the genocide.
And everybody else is kind of gather around the bottom here.
Our transportation now.
Insignificant amount of them that you saw here and various other places. I personally would like to see October 12th changed to Italian Day, Leonardo da Vinci Day, or Joe DiMaggio Day.
Right on. Let's hear it for Joe.
But I do not want to see it dedicated to this Spanish Jew. And that's what he was. He wasn't even Italian. He copped out. It was during the Spanish Inquisition. He changed races. He was a Spanish Jew, and to escape the Spanish Inquisition, he changed over to Italian. So I can respect Italian heritage as long as it remains Italian. When Cristobal Colon arrived on the island of Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, there were over 3 million Indian people estimated by the Spaniards themselves. Over 3 million. 10 years later, there were less than 300. 10 years, over 3 million Indians were slaughtered by this man. And that's who these people are celebrating.
The reason that we're here is out of respect for our ancestors and out of respect for our children. And this is our time in history. And so I'd like for Russell Means to say a few words because he brings to us today his history of 30 or 40 years of struggle.
The easiest thing to do in the struggle is to mobilize. It's easy to mobilize a bunch of people, go out and carry some signs, shout around, march around. It's easy. For any cause, or any issue, anywhere at any time. The real problem is how to organize. Mobilize is easy, organize is what it's all about. That's the only two things you need. The two people can change the world. I've seen it happen in this country time and time again. I've also seen when just one person goes out and changes the world. When that one person dies, everything crumbles, fades away. Number one, you're smarter. Number two, they're scared, and you got more power. First of all, you got spiritual power. Second of all, you got faith. Third of all, you got a brain. They have none of that. Important person they fear on this earth, and this is how valuable you guys are. They fear brown people. They fear every brown person on earth. Think about it. That's how much power you inherently have, is you have the power to induce their fear. And when people act out of fear, they make mistakes and they can't think. over how pitiful those Italians did. And there's just a few of them. Police are out there to protect them. Barricades are up. See all that fear? All that fear?
Holiday is right here in this town. You kill the root, you kill the tree. To go home tonight and in the quiet of your own home with yourself, make the commitment. Not just to shut down the parade, not just to get rid of that statue, not just to shut down this dinner. Then what? Then what? You gotta have a vision. You must have a vision for your kids and for their kids and for the next 7 generations. So it's not enough for us to say no more Columbus Day. We have to create a new future for our communities. And next year, let's turn up the volume. Let's turn up the heat. Me taco, yeah.
Bazon katapi nui kana tapuish mana tu wishikatu lukush law pa me gwich. First thing I'd like to say is I got rid of those sick glasses that I was wearing. Gee, somebody should have told me about that. That was bad.
Hold on to them, they're coming back.
I think I ran those over with my truck. Seriously, it pains me to have to be a weak replacement for my brother, Russell Means, today. Pains me to have to report that he's quite ill and that he knows that this event is happening. I visited with him in Arizona last week, about 10 days ago, and he sends his solidarity, he sends his warm wishes to you. I told him about some of the things that I was going to say, so he's demanding a report this evening from me that I accurately reflected his positions and his values. He's very appreciative of all of your thoughts and your prayers. Some of you may have known that he was recovering from a very serious bout with cancer this past year. And once he was diagnosed, he went into ceremony. He used a lot of traditional medicines, some alternative Western techniques as well. And in April, he was declared cancer-free. Unfortunately, he didn't rest sufficiently, and he began to go back to work. And he made a film, which will be released in February, actually at the Sundance Film Festival, with Katie Holmes and William Hurt, called Seagull, which will be released early next year. And he did a program on Cinemax, which I believe is either airing now, I don't get Cinemax, so I don't know, either airing now or about to air, called Banshee, in which he plays Indigenous elder. So, but unfortunately that schedule decreased his ability of his immune system to fight off infection, so he contracted a very serious case of pneumonia. And because of that, some of the opportunistic cancer cells apparently returned to his stomach and to his bones. And so, but do not ever count out Russell Means. He's a fighter. He's fighting back, and he sends his warmest greetings to you all. So my hope is today to be able to speak for a few moments and have some dialogue with you as well about the video, about recounting history. I know that certainly if Russell were here, he'd be very appreciative of the library hosting this event. Felicia, certainly Rita Martinez, a good, strong friend and ally of ours for a long time. Rudy Ballas from Southern Colorado AIM, who've invited us to come and be with you today, and then also at CSU Pueblo tomorrow evening, where I'll have more formal remarks to make. Because this event is really about historical memory. What a society remembers and what it forgets. Not necessarily even what it forgets, what it erases or what it invisibilizes. And so this event that's captured in this fine short video is just a microcosm, just a very small piece of what the struggle of Russell means, the American Indian movement, because Russell will be the first to tell you the movement for Indigenous people's liberation, which he was honored to help begin in the United States in the early 1970s, is just a very small part of a much larger point of conflict with regard to power. And there's a fairly famous quote by Milan Kundera. Some of you might know his work, the great Czech historian. He wrote several historical books and several novels. One of the better novels that I believe he wrote was The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. And there's a very poignant line in that novel that I think reflects the motivation of Russell Means and those of us who learned from him and followed behind him. And that line is, the struggle for man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Of memory against forgetting. And for Russell Means, his entire life has been about refusing to allow the United States and other settler states in the Americas to forget that history did not begin on October 12, 1492. History in the Americas did not begin on that day. Even though many, many textbooks for many, many decades seem to suggest that. And they call the period before that prehistory or pre-Columbian history, as though it's somehow inferior, it's somehow diminished. And Russell has always known, as have the rest of us in the American Indian movement, that there's a very rich history that runs deep in the land upon which we now sit. I teach at the University of Colorado at Denver. I teach a course right now called Indigenous Political Systems. Indigenous Political Systems. I remember the first time I taught that course. And I was at a meeting of the American Political Science Association. And I was speaking to some of my colleagues. And they said, well, what are you going to teach next semester? I was so excited. I developed this new course, Indigenous Political Systems. I said, I'm going to teach Indigenous Political Systems. And they said to me, what will that take, about 15 minutes? Of course they were joking with me, but on some level it was kind of serious. And it was really an embarrassed seriousness because they had never been taught about indigenous political systems. They had never been taught that the Constitution under which you now live was derived in part from the great Iroquois Confederacy. They had never been taught that the kinds of values that we search for, that we strive for in the United States today, were already present in the Americas. Separation of powers, a government that derives its power from the consent of the governed, gender equality in political decision-making, total participation at the grassroots level, even by children. Those elements were already present here, but have been erased from the conventional textbooks that we use all the time. And that might be on the shelves at this very library. And I'm always fond of remembering my brother's words at a number of Columbus Day gatherings, when he recounts one of his daughters coming home from school in the first or second grade and asking, Dad, where were the Indians when Columbus showed up? Because she'd never been taught that. Her classmates had never been taught that. And some of you are contemporaries of mine. You must remember when we were in elementary school, we were taught the demographic figures of this hemisphere. Oh, maybe 1 million Indians in what's now North America, maybe 12 million in the whole hemisphere, North and South America combined. Remember those demographic figures? The Smithsonian was putting them out until the 1970s. Until some new demographers came along and said, these figures are way off. And perhaps there were 12 or 15 million indigenous people just in what's now the United States. And perhaps 100 million in the hemisphere. Well, what difference does that make? It's the process of invisibilizing us. And it's the process of justifying both legal and political and cultural arguments that suggest that this was a wilderness, just ripe for the taking by much more civilized and advanced peoples from around the world. And that's where it begins. Because these protests, I mean, as much as Russ is in this film saying that, like, kind of refuting Columbus's genealogy, which we can certainly talk about, the point of these protests then and now is not about Columbus, really. It's about what Columbus means. It's about how Columbus is translated into law. I'm trained as an attorney as well as a professor. And I can tell you that what these protests are about is not so much Columbus the man. He's dead. But the legacy of Columbus and discovery and the doctrine of discovery, in legal terms, which is still being fought today in the federal courts and all the way to the United Nations, is what these protests are about. And so to diminish or trivialize this issue by saying, oh, aren't there more important things that Indians have to worry about? What about that alcoholism? What about all that poverty on reservations? What about the cultural poverty, hopelessness? Aren't those more important? No. In a word, no. And the answer is no, because every single one of those maladies that I mentioned can be traced back to the doctrine of discovery. That's not just a turn of the phrase. That's language that has meaning. And we know it because we experience it every day. Every Native person in there experiences it every day. So when Russell Means comes to Pueblo or Denver or goes to South Dakota or Arizona to engage in these kinds of actions, it's not simply theater and not theatrics. I know for Russell this is a life and death struggle. Because every day, more and more and more of our young people are drawn into a historical amnesia. More and more of our young people don't even know who this man is. Our young people, let alone the young people in other communities. Oh, that's the guy from Last of the Mohicans, yeah. They've never learned that he survived 12 assassination attempts, was shot, stabbed, imprisoned, because he wanted notoriety? What, because he wanted publicity? No, there are a lot easier ways to get that. Because he was fighting for the survival of his people. And so when he shows up in Pueblo or Denver, it's not because he's looking for the cameras. You can get the cameras in Hollywood. It's because he understands how fundamentally important combating historical amnesia is, not just for his children or his grandchildren, but for yours. Some of you may know an ethnobiologist named Wes Jackson. Has a place over in Salina, Kansas called the Land Institute. He wrote a book once called Becoming Native to This Place. Becoming native to this place. You know, I know Russell well enough to know. I know him probably as well as any living person other than his wife. And I think that I can tell you that Russell would say, that's a good idea. For everybody who's come here since Columbus to think about becoming native to this place. But in order to become native to this place, you'd better understand the history of this place. And our connection to the history of this place. So when I see archive projects like at CSU Pueblo coming around, hey, that's a good idea. Because I teach a new generation of children who don't know what it is to read a newspaper or a magazine. If it's not on that screen, it's not going in their head. That's a serious problem. Because the question, as Kundera says, it's about power. And who controls those screens? Who controls what goes into the memory of those databases? I'm sorry, I'm from the old school. I like that tactile reinforcement. I like to feel those pages turning in my fingers. I like to be able to verify it myself and not rely on an electronic source that tells me, oh, this is what the record says. I want to go look at the record. I want those primary sources available to me. That's what Russell Means is about. He says, great, it'd be great if people became native to this place. But that's going to be more and more and more difficult as these resources get placed into electronic sources only. I just had to have a fight in my department, my political science department. They wanted to get rid of our departmental library. They got several thousand books probably in our library. It's a waste of space. Nobody comes in here and reads these books anymore. None of our students use the library anymore. And my response was, maybe that's our fault. But I'm not giving up the library. I'm sorry. And scan all those books. Get them on Google Books. I want to feel them. I want to look at it. I want to turn the pages myself. So becoming native to this place. Oh boy, Russell would love that. If people got serious about doing that, about engaging in that project, about remembering the names of these mountains before Pike, before Evans, before Meeker. The names of these rivers, the names of those plants out there. The importance of these spaces. The history of the value of oral tradition. How many medicines have we destroyed in creating the progress of this, the progress in air quotes of this place? How many cures for the cancer that he now suffers from might have been destroyed because those were Indian medicines. Those were primitive medicines. That's the value of remembering. But with every generation that leaves us in the Indian world, we're left further and further impoverished. Intellectually, spiritually, culturally, politically, economically. I mentioned the seventh generation in that little excerpt. Was our responsibility to the seventh generation? Every morning I was taught when I was growing up, every morning I'm supposed to give thanks to those 7 generations behind me who were thinking of me, who never even knew me, knew nothing about me, but who remembered me so that I could stand here before you today. And what is our responsibility to the next 7th generation? It is to join that battle of memory versus forgetting. To keep the things that Russell said. I really appreciate this video. Boy, I love looking at Russ. He's taught me so much. We fought a lot of battles together. Nearly died together several times. And we can't forget his message. I hope that most of you have read his book, Where White Men Fear to Tread. Because whether you like it or don't like it, whether you like him or don't like him, he tells you the truth. He tells you the truth as he knows it. In our indigenous traditions, we don't have a concept like in some traditions of the truth, some complete totalizing truth. We have many truths, multiple truths. Those are the truths that he knows. And if he was standing here today, there's one thing that I know he would mention about this archival project. And he said it in this video. That there are certain power sources, whether it's at the local level or the state level, the national level, the international level. And that's the difference between those institutions and indigenous societies. Our societies were not rooted in fear. They were rooted in hope. That's why we always thought about the seventh generation. We knew it would come. And so the one thing that I know that he would mention if he were standing here in front of you about this archival project is that the most dangerous thing that this Columbus campaign, because this Columbus campaign wasn't just this year. This Columbus campaign started in 1989, 4 years before the 500th anniversary in Denver. And people, of course, must know, since it started in the city, that Columbus Day began in Colorado. Now think about that in terms of erasing or remembering history. Why would a holiday celebrating a lost, fill in the blank, Genoese, Spanish, Catalonian navigator begin in Colorado? But do you have a summer home here? Why would it begin here? So he knew this campaign, which went through 1992, and there was no parade in Denver between 92 and 2000. Because we showed up in 1992 with about 2,500 people ready to go to jail, saying, okay, that's enough historical revisionism here. But he made a speech then and since then to say one of the most frightening things to the city government in Denver was to see once again this alliance between Chicanos and Indians. He said, I'm not sure they're going to be able to withstand that. And it grew and it grew and it grew. Just like back in the day when Jorge Gonzalez and the Crusade for Justice marched down the street with the American Indian movement. And there's no doubt in my mind, or the mind of most AIM people or most Crusade people, that that Crusade for Justice building in Denver was blown up. Specifically because of the alliance between the Crusade and the American Indian movement over the liberation of Wounded Knee in 1973. Russell would say that if he were standing here. That's why those archives are important. Because our children and our grandchildren must understand the power of those kinds of alliances. And if we don't have those archives, then they rely on Google. They rely on some electronic database over which we have little to no control. And eventually, their history is erased. So it's a great amount of humility that I come and speak to you today and share a few words with you. I know we want to have some question and answers, but I want to read you, I've done this with Russell before, I want to read you a short poem that both Russell and I like, from a poet whose name was Marge Piercy. Some of you may know her work. And it's a poem that kind of epitomizes not feeling disempowered by a critique like I'm giving, but rather to be empowered by it. And it's a poem that she wrote called The Low Road. I've read it at Columbus Day, I've read it at Occupy Denver, other occasions. Sometimes there's an anniversary up in Denver of Luis Jr. Martinez, who was killed during the Crusade explosion in 1973. March 17th every year, it's commemorated. This poem is called The Low Road. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity. Blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight. You can refuse. You can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, give support, conviction, love, massage, hope. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on, one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they've said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day, you mean one more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anybody have any questions you'd like to ask Mr. Morris? Raise your hand.
I must have said something provocative, yes.
Well, I'm interested in what is going on internationally, since you've been very active in there, and that what kind of support that Indigenous movements, within political boundaries, get from the international UN type activity.
Thank you for bringing up that question, especially because this is part of a history that has been erased in our own community sometimes. We were talking about it just before we came here. Russell Means started that international work in our generation. Of course, there were predecessors. Descahe back in the 1920s from the Six Nations went to the League of Nations. But since the United Nations was created, in 1974 there was an International Indian Treaty Conference on the Standing Rock Reservation in North and South Dakota. And at that conference, Russell Means was given the responsibility by a number of elders. They gave him a sacred chanupa, pipe, and said, we want you to take this into the international community so that they understand not just our condition, not just our plight, that they understand our status, that we have 371 treaties with the United States of America. Treaties are binding international contracts between nations. They're not legal niceties. They're not polite little documents that the United States, in its generosity, gave to Indian people. They are at-length agreements between two co-equal nations. And the United States got the benefit and gave a bargain. And those elders told Russell, we want you to take these treaties into the international arena and compel the international arena to address these issues. He went to New York City, to the headquarters of the United Nations, started an office across the street with a couple of other people. The organization is called the International Indian Treaty Council. And in 1977, it was the first indigenous non-governmental organization to receive recognition by the Economic and Social Council. Since that time, but let me be clear, that if Russell Means had not spearheaded that effort, when the United Nations General Assembly ratified the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I had an honor in helping to draft, in 2007, that would not, in my opinion, have happened. So the cutting edge of international human rights law, which is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is a direct consequence of the vision, the courage, and the strength that Russell Means put forward. Now, that said, is the international work sufficient? No, it's not. The last 3 years, I've taken a delegation of Indigenous students from the University of Colorado, Denver, to the United Nations to participate at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City. In fact, my niece is in the back. She got thrown out this year because she was following the example of her uncle and her uncles, I suppose. They had a little protest out front of the United Nations, holding signs because they were trying to pull this. I can't go into all the details. It was real convoluted, but they tried to impose these really convoluted rules. So they were outside the UN holding signs saying, "Let us in." They were going to ban these young people for life from the United Nations. Well, needless to say, that didn't stand. But that's emblematic of some of the issues that continue to confront Indigenous peoples. And this is part of the historical process. This is why we need an archives, for a variety of issues and struggles. Because the world is a much different place now than in 1977 when Russell Means went to New York to the United Nations. If you would have told me then that there would be no Soviet Union in 25 years, I would have told you you were out of your mind. You know, if you would have told me that all of these governments would have toppled, I would have asked for your commitment. The world has changed dramatically since then. It was a bipolar world then. The Soviet Union and the United States fighting one another. And there were spaces because of that fight. Whether you like the Soviet Union or the United States or not. Whether in Africa, whether in Asia, whether in the Americas, the Arctic. And it was in those spaces that the International Indigenous Peoples Movement took hold and grew. And grew and grew. So now there's a global network of Indigenous peoples who share their stories, who can go to New York every year and tell the world, these guys are killing us. It's just a massacre in Guatemala 2 days ago, right? In 1981, 100,000 Indian people were killed in Guatemala, and it took months and months and months for those stories to get out. Now we hear it the next day, in part because of this struggle, this movement. So the strength of that international movement is not from the United Nations itself. Remember, the United Nations is a collection of states with state interests. They protect each other, these countries. It's a collection of states. By all rights, it should be called the United States, but that name was already taken, so they had to settle for the United Nations. That's a little joke.
Just a little follow-up.
Yeah,
sorry.
sure.
So has there been any thought about putting together a United Nations of Indigenous peoples who would be like a parallel to the UN?
Yes. The question is, has there been any movement towards indigenous peoples forming our own United Indigenous Nations? Yes, there has been. And there continues to be. And let me tell you where this is especially taking root. Because right now in Chiang Mai, Thailand, there's a meeting of the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And what's going on in Chiang Mai is all these countries are trying to develop a legal regime on intellectual property. Now this all sounds real highfalutin to most people, especially you go to the grassroots, you go to reservations, start talking about intellectual property, this, that. They go, what the hell are you talking about? And we have to say, we'll tell you what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody coming in and taking those medicines that we've been using from time immemorial and patenting them so that you can't use them anymore. Taking those seed stocks that your community has been raising for 10,000 years, genetically modifying them and patenting them so that you can't use them anymore. Taking your songs, copywriting them, putting them on CDs so that you can't use them anymore. Taking the entire essence of what it means to be an indigenous people and ensnaring it in a legal regime. You know, my friend Winona LaDuke. Anybody know Winona LaDuke? She's an Anishinaabe warrior of the highest degree. She has several books. I encourage you to look at her work. She works with wild rice. They're harvesting right now. Monsanto wants to come in, genetically modify wild rice, and patent it so that these communities in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin who've been harvesting wild rice from time immemorial could be sued then in this international regime by Monsanto or other corporations or even governments. So indigenous peoples are forming networks with one another, saying, how can we share seeds with one another? How can we develop our agricultural techniques and keep them and pass them on to future generations out of the reach of this intellectual property regime? Because that regime is not for us. That regime is for Monsanto or Dow Chemical or Union Carbide or all these huge transnational corporations who neither care about your health or your children's health or your grandchildren's. They care about the bottom line. And so there is a movement because there is a recognition by indigenous peoples around the world that those rules that the UN operates with, just like the Supreme Court of the United States, those rules are not our rules. Those rules come from an entirely different place. And Russell Means would tell you this. He would say, it's a poisonous place. And so it's important for all of us to have a historical record, to look back. Any of you remember a newspaper called Akwesasne Notes? Akwesasne Notes, it was the most powerful, in the Indian world, it was the most powerful communications tool in the 1970s for the struggle. And I'm trying to put an archive together of Akwesasne Notes and forcing the United States to comply with the terms of that treaty. Because under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, that treaty remains the supreme law of the land. And hopefully he'll be around for many, many years to advance that. But that's why he went to the UN. To say, we've got this treaty. And under the Vienna Convention, that treaty should be given international legal standing and personality. And he's trying to push for a case to go to the International Court of Justice, the World Court, to get an international opinion about that treaty and the other 371 treaties between the United States and indigenous peoples.
I just have a couple of statements to make. One of them is that as a Chicano mestizo, elder in the Chicano community, I want to thank you very much for coming here. And I hope Brother Means gets better. In '92, I was one of 7 people that was arrested in Denver for stopping Columbus Day. So this is my 20th anniversary. And also, and another thing that's dear to my heart is the Chicano Movement Archives. I'm one of the founding fathers. I'm one of the first donators. My name is Juan Federico Miguel Arroyo Trujillo, alias Freddy Freak. And it's there for people, like you say. You can open La Cucaracha, El Diario, other Chicano newspapers. 40 years ago, same church, different pew, still there, you know. And it's people like you and Brother Russell who have struggled to bring this information to us, and bless you for that and continue on your struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Someone else have a question over here?
I would like you to tell everybody a little bit more about Monsanto and trying to take the seeds, because I do know 2 points that are very important and would be important in this room. They are trying to make the seeds so they only last 1 year, and so then people would have to buy their seeds because you couldn't use seeds that you have saved. And then also about the seeds blowing over into another person's property.
Right, so without taking an inordinate amount of time, and I do encourage you to, there's a book by a very renowned author, Vandana Shiva, who's actually trained as a nuclear physicist, but she wrote a book called Seed Wars, and, or I'm sorry, it's called what's it called? I'll think of it in a second. Harvest of, I'll think of it in a moment. But Vandana Shiva, S-H-I-V-A. And she's one of the most prominent international advocates. She's from India originally, and so it's extremely important in India to be able to have free seed exchange. But for all of us it is. And so Monsanto, the technology that you're talking about is called Terminator technology, where Monsanto comes in and genetically modified seeds, so they actually commit suicide after one harvest. There have been a few federal cases that have been brought by Monsanto against farmers because Monsanto sends out seed police. And where there's a farm that has Monsanto seed growing, they then go to adjoining farms and take samples, and if they find the Terminator seeds on other farmers' property because they blow the wind carries seeds, as we all know, Monsanto then sues those farmers, even though those farmers don't even want the seed on their property. They sue the farmers for theft of their product. And so it becomes a very, very convoluted chain of events. There are several documentaries out about Monsanto that if people watch Free Speech TV, or if you can go online and watch some of these online, that really expose not just Monsanto. It's not only Monsanto, but certainly Monsanto is in the forefront of some of these technologies. And we see other corporations doing similar kinds of things. For example, going to Chiapas in Mexico, where some corn strains are 10,000 years old. And the companies will go in and try to introduce genetically modified corn into those communities. Sometimes they'll give it away. Say, here's some great new corn. It's insect resistant. You don't have to do this or you don't have to do that. And the communities, to their credit, for the most part in Chiapas, have rejected them. Well, when that happened, Mexico was sued in the World Trade Organization because by not intervening, it was alleged that Mexico was creating unfair trade barriers to these corporations that wanted to introduce genetically modified seed, and lost. And so it gave the Mexican government the incentive then to go into rural communities and try to force the introduction of GMO seeds. Now we see this is not just an issue for indigenous peoples by any means. This is a dire concern for people around the world. And so in Europe right now, there are huge debates going on about the introduction of various kinds of genetically modified organisms or seeds. And so I do encourage you. I thank you for your question, and I do encourage you to try to stay up on that. But Vandana Shiva is really if there's a single point person, like Russ might be the single point person for some of these issues, Vandana Shiva, in my mind, is certainly a heroine for all of us.
Is it Dana?
Stolen Harvest. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Morris, for sharing all of your knowledge and everything with us here today. We are so grateful. Please give me. Thank you, Mr. Morris. Once again, if you're interested in donating in some way to the Colorado Chicano Movement Archives, the archive seeks donations of materials that document the Colorado Chicano movement, such as letters, photographs, diaries, minutes, home videos or movies, even oral histories, audio recordings, speeches, or newspaper articles. And just before you leave today, I hope all of you pick up either our Pueblo Library newsletter or an information on resources. This month is our month-long All Pueblo Reads. It's in full swing, and this year's book is called Plain Song by Kent Harif. There's a cover there. The project features a variety of different events based on themes within the book, which centers around life in small-town Colorado, Holt, Colorado specifically. And for more information, you can also look on our pueblolibrary.org website. Thank you again so much for all of you being here for this wonderful event, and thank you so much again, Mr. Morris, for being here.